everyone. I'm Dr. Elisheva Frist, and this is One-on-One Women Talk Torah, a series brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. Welcome back to Matan's One-on-One podcast, where we spend 30 minutes speaking about the parsha. Our episodes in the book of Bereshit focus on family and interpersonal dynamics. These conversations are candid, insightful, and respectful. We aim not to psychoanalyze the biblical figures, but to learn from them as we stumble through our own beautifully messy lives. It's not too late to register for yearly classes. Check out the Matan website for all relevant information. This week's episode is dedicated in memory of Elisheva Frist, beloved daughter, sister, aunt, and friend, who we tragically lost a few weeks ago. Elisheva was an unbelievably creative, kind, smart, balanced, and principled person who, in her quiet way, moved and touched the lives of so many. Her passing is an unfathomable loss, and I pray that her family and friends will be able to find meaningful ways to carry her with them in spite of her physical absence. If you would like to sponsor a podcast episode in honor or memory of a loved one, please contact the Matan office via telephone or email us at podcast@matan.org.il. Parshat Noach opens with a descriptive portrait of Noach's family and the explanation of the flood's necessity. The flood is a story with multiple parts: Noach's physical preparations, the actual flooding of the earth, the receding waters, the exit of Noach and his family from the ark, the covenant of the rainbow symbolizing God's resolve to never repeat world destruction as a solution to man's corruption, and the somewhat enigmatic story of Noach's planting a grape vineyard, which results in a shameful encounter with his children that sets up a paradigm for their future success and subservience to one another. After the flood narrative, chapter 10 contains what scholars call the Table of Nations, which maps out the population dispersion of Noach's three sons. Yefet transforms into a sea-dwelling people, often associated with the Greeks. Cham becomes land warriors associated with the nations of Canaan. And Shem, from who Abraham descends, are likely nomads, forming a physical bridge between land and water. The parsha continues with the famous Tower of Babel story, which will be the focus of today's conversation, and closes with the genealogy of Shem, eventually Avram's family. This narrows the Torah's spotlight on the family of Terach and Abraham, moving away from the universal focus of Bereshit's first 11 chapters and shifts to one family who will be charged with the first attempt to model a perfected moral and religious existence for the world. My guest today is Rabbi Professor Sam Lebens, Associate Professor in the Philosophy Department at the University of Haifa, who is also an Orthodox rabbi and Jewish educator. His first book was a study of Bertrand Russell's evolving theories about the nature of meaning. His second book is a study in analytic philosophy of Judaism. Sam is also the co-founder and served as the founding chair of the Association for the Philosophy of Judaism, which, if that's your area of interest, please check out their excellent website for content and information about upcoming events. Sam, it's an honor to have you here today.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Elisheva. Thank you.
I'll be honest and say that I first heard you on the 1840 podcast, where you spoke about one of the episodes about rational Judaism.
Right.
And I was really taken in general with that series, and also with your conversation, which also just felt very candid and honest about what we can really speak and know about our Jewish life and traditions. So I'm thrilled to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So take us in to the story of Babel, wherever that feels right for you today.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's kind of funny because if we're thinking about family and interpersonal relationships, the story of Babel is not the obvious place to go in Parshat Noach. I mean, as you mentioned in your kind of précis of the parsha, there's a rich study to be written on the family of Noach and the dysfunctionality that's finally manifest in that last scene you speak about when Noach gets drunk and there's this some sort of shameful incident between Ham and Noach in his nudity, and it's not exactly sure what happens, and then the reaction of Shem and Yafet to that, so there's lots we could speak about here, whereas the story of Babel isn't obviously a story about families at all. And yet, I think there's something important to be said. So let me start with one observation. We talk about the story of Babel as the entire world was of one language. In fact, that's the first verse of chapter 11 of Genesis. Vayikol haaretz va'echad dvarim achadim. Everyone on earth had the same language and the same words. And they built this tower. And the response to whatever it was they did wrong, and it's a very enigmatic passage because it's not clear from the text, at least, what was actually wrong with what they were doing or what they were planning to do or what they had done or what they were going to do. But either way, the response of God is to thwart their plans, to disperse them, and to undermine this unity of language that they had by dividing their languages. But the peculiar thing about that is, what did you call it? The table of nations? Is that what biblical scholars call it? Right. The table of nations happens at the end of chapter 10, before the story of Babel. And when it divides Noah's progeny, so you've got all of the descendants of Ham and all of the descendants of Japheth and the descendants of Shem, although we come back to the descendants of Shem, like you said, after the story of Babel, because the descendants of Shem become the main focus because of Abraham. Nonetheless, when we divide these families out, this is a recurring phrase of this table of nations. It says, Eila v'nei X, right? These are the descendants of so-and-so. One time it's Ham, one time it's Japheth, one time it's Shem. Eila v'nei, let's take Eila v'nei Shem. And it says, Lemishbechotam, lilshonatam, ba'artzotam, legoyehem, which means we've given a genealogy and we have divided them according to their families, according to their languages, according to their lands, and according to their nations. So it looks as if there's already a division of languages, right? You've got all these people and all these different languages. So then what's happening at the beginning of chapter 11 when it says everyone had one language? You're like, what?
You know, I don't know if I'm going to take anything that you plan on saying, but I'll say that from the Bible side of things, not the philosophy side of things. I'm going to leave that for you today. From the Bible side of things, so obviously this question comes up. It seems like it would be much more fitting for the Tower of Babel to be placed before the Table of Nations. And one of the answers that's given is that if the story of Babel would have come before chapter 10, then we would have looked at the dispersion of humans as only something negative. It would only be something that looks as if it's a punishment, or again, that question of it's a punishment or a natural consequence. But because we put that before the story of Babel, it lets us know that while they did something wrong in that story with Babel, the general concept of diversity and of language diversity is something that at its core is a good thing.
Yes.
That's one idea that's offered.
Yes, I think that will be very resonant with some of the things I want to take from the story. Either way, we want to say something like linguistic diversity, cultural diversity, national diversity was part of the plan, and therefore it's presented in the book of Genesis as almost an ideal. I like that reading very much, irrespective of the chronology. And we're going to see that one of the things that we learn from the story of Babel is that God wants some sort of human diversity. Okay, so good. So that's the first observation I want to make. And I also want to point out that when we're talking about diversity in this model that the Table of Nations gives us, it's linguistic diversity, right? Because they're divided according to their languages. It's geographical diversity. And that's important because I think that when people develops a civilization in a given climate or a given environment, those geographical kind of differences will make an impact on the human experience and therefore on the culture and therefore on the language. Clearly, the climate and the landscape in which we live are going to shape our experiences too. And that seems to be one of the things God wants us to have diversity of. Right? The human experience should be lived out in different lands. There's a national diversity, it says, according to their goyehem, according to their nations. But also it says first among this list is according to their families, lemishbechotam, right? So if we're thinking about what is the ideal arrangement of humanity, that Babel was something of a threat to, right? That ideal arrangement includes the existence of families. Okay, so that's my first observation. Yeah,
I think also that I could say it also somewhat differently, that in the book of Genesis, the basis of all nations is family.
Indeed.
Meaning we look today at the base of nation could be their cultural aspiration, or it could be their geography, or it could be a shared heritage, but in very clearly the Table of Nations, and perhaps in its antidote, the story of Babel, says that at the basis of all society really needs to be familial tribes, which of course still exist in many societies today. And even as a culture, there are many ways, for example, that we see that sort of tribal base, family base, even in the state of Israel today. I mean, that's another topic that I often talk about with people who make Aliyah. They have to understand that they're coming to a place where everything surrounds people's families.
Yes.
And so when you're coming and you don't have that family base, you end up having to try and figure out how to create it, because that's how the society organizes itself. But that's a side point about life in Israel.
So the second observation I want to make is more broad scope observation about the location of the story in the book of Genesis as a whole, right? The story of Babel is in the final chapter of the pre-Abraham story. In fact, Abraham makes a little appearance right at the end of chapter 11. But the election of Abraham happens in the first verse of chapter 12, right, which is the beginning of Parshat Lech Lecha. So if the Bible is the story of the Jewish people, its relationship with God, its laws, its destiny, its mission, the first 11 chapters, something of a misnomer. Like, what are they doing? They're like the prelude to the main story of the Bible, from the beginning of Parshat Lech Lecha to the end of Divrei Yamim at the end of Tanakh. It's one long story about God and the Jewish people, primarily, and yet chapters 1 to the end of 11 are about something else. And for Rabbi Sachs, my teacher and mentor, great inspiration to me, for Rabbi Sachs, this was a key to understanding the entire Jewish mission, to understanding what those first 11 chapters of Sefer Bereshit are about, which is that, yes, there is a particular relationship between God and the Jewish people, and that's our focus as Jews, but the God of the Jewish people is also the God of all of humanity. And there's this really interesting interplay in Judaism between particularism and universalism. And we don't give up on either pole of that spectrum, the particular and the universal. So, for instance, Islam and Christianity are both religions who believe in one God for all of humanity, but they also think there needs to be one religion for all of humanity, right? So it's kind of universal all the way, right? Whereas the Jewish people and the Jewish religion is unique in its belief in a God for all of humanity that manifests in a religion for a particular people. And the story of Genesis chapters 1 to 11 are laying the universalistic framework within which the particular relationship between God and the Jewish people takes place. It's important to note that this is the location, chapters 1 to 12, are the location of the 7 mitzvahs of Bnei Noach, according to the rabbinic tradition. So this is where we learn what the universal responsibilities are for all of humanity. And finally, it's interesting to note that in Parshat Lech Lecha, when God does elect Abraham, he tells him why. He says, V'nivrechu v'cha kol mishpachot ha'adama. All of the families of the world will be blessed through you. And I think it's just interesting to note again that, first of all, the election of the Jewish people has a purpose that's universal. Somehow, and we're not going to talk about it today, I imagine, but somehow the election of the Jewish people and their role in the service of God is supposed to be a good for the entire world. It's also interesting to note that the family is the unit even of the Gentiles that's going to receive this blessing ultimately, right? Mishpachot ha'adama, all the families of the world. I think it would be beneficial now to look more closely at the psukim. Mm-hmm. The first thing we're told about this project in Babel that was everyone on earth had the same language and the same words. As we've already raised, it's not clear whether that was because this is before the Table of Nations occurred, before the dispersion that we're about to read, or whether it was a concerted effort to reunify after a kind of natural dispersion post-flood. That's not clear. I think it's also important to look closely at the Hebrew of that particular verse. It says everyone on earth had the same language and the same words. That's one translation. But it's Vayihi chol haaretz safa echat. Everyone was of one language. Udvarim achadim. And the same things or the same matters. There are lots of different readings of this. In fact, some go so far as to read, and I'm talking about sources pre-communism. You see this in Abarbanel. You see this also in Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch on the parsha. The idea of Dvarim Achadim might be common ownership, You could translate the words that way. Everybody kind of co-owned everything. There was no private property, right? So, wow, we've already got this kind of very collectivist reading. It's Babel as a communist state. It's important to look at verse 3 of the story. So what you have here in verse 3, it's not quite the first use of technology in the Bible, because we've already had some inventions already. For instance, metal tools and musical instruments. But there is a move towards technology in verse 3, because they say, come, let us make bricks and burn them hard. Brick served them as stone, and bitumen served them as mortar. So instead of these natural ingredients, stone and mortar, they're using brick and bitumen, which they've manufactured. So you have an allusion to collectivism. You have an allusion towards industrialization, perhaps. This furnace is an important image for the rabbinic imagination. What I wanted to share with you, Yosefa, and your listeners is a comment of the Netziv. And before we get to him, I just want to point out that he's also keen to raise this midrashic allusion in verse 3. What am I talking about? The furnace. So they cook their bricks in the furnace. There's a famous midrash that Abraham, who's already alive at this time, was threatened by Nimrod to be thrown into this furnace. So it's not just that bricks are made in the furnace, but the furnace is also a disciplinarian, or it's like a mode of torture or punishment or killing in this kind of totalitarian
I'll obviously
state.
Also say that in the modern times post-Holocaust, this image takes on a whole different level of significance.
Absolutely.
I'll just take one step back, by the way, about the technology piece, which is that verse 3, which focuses on how they made their bricks. Mm-hmm. First of all, there's a very odd word called hava, which means let us. And it's used a number of times here. It may also be alluded to in the story of Paro in Egypt. Yes. There he also uses the word hava.
When they plot to
it's
slay
a lot of... Yeah. Exactly. And there's some interesting parallels there. I don't think we'll have time to talk about today, but I'll just throw that nugget out to anybody who wants to think about that story in the first chapter of Shemot. But in this verse, there are many words spent on discussing the creation of these bricks. And I agree with you that another element to this story is that there is not only perhaps a comment, criticism, or discomfort that's reflected about diversity or lack of diversity in the world, but there's also a criticism here of technology, meaning there's also a comment that is made about how technology needs to be we need boundaries when it comes to technology, and this story through that prism is also utterly relevant, obviously, to the world we live in today.
Absolutely. And then we've got verse 4, which I think is crucial for understanding. I think we have a key to opening up what was motivating these people, these collectivist, industrial type people that we're painting a picture of. They want to build this big tower with its head in the heavens, says the fourth verse, which is why some rabbis want to read it as some sort of war against God. They're trying to invade the heavens. But I think more importantly, for the direction I want to take us in and to bring us back to family, they say, by building this tower, we shall make for ourselves a name, and we won't be dispersed. Somehow the building of the tower will prevent their dispersion, which is ironic because it turns out to be the very thing that causes God, so to speak, in the verses that follow, say, what are they trying to do? I'm going to come down and disperse them just because they build the tower. So what I wanted to do with you, Yosefa, in the few minutes we have left is to focus on what the Netziv has to say about this phrase, lest we be scattered over the face of the earth. And I think it will bring us directly back to the attack that Babel may have been on the flourishing of families.
I'll just briefly mention that we discussed the Netziv in an earlier episode of the podcast with Simi Peters. It was episode, I believe it was 72. And I'll just remind us all the Netziv is Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, who lived from 1816 to 1893, one of sort of these preeminent modern voices in the rabbinic world. So take us in. This is definitely one of his I would say, more well broadcasted comments on the Torah.
It's a fabulous piece. And I'm only going to look at just a little bit, and I'll allude to more that he says as well. But he says, so lest we be scattered over all the face of the earth, he focuses in, he zooms in on that phrase, and he says, and I'll just read the English translation that I pillaged from Sefaria. Thank you to the good people at Sefaria. It says, however, we must understand why they feared that someone might lead to another land. And it's understood that this was related to the uniformity that was among them. And since the opinions of people are not identical, they feared that people might abandon this philosophy and adopt another. Therefore, they sought to ensure that no one would leave their society, and one who veered from this uniformity among them was judged with burning, just as they did to our forefather Abraham in the Midrashic story where he is thrown by Nimrod into that furnace. And he continues, he says, and the Devarim Achadim, which we focused on, the same words, can also be seen as the fact that they would kill whoever did not think like them. He even goes so far as to say that the purpose of the tower was so that everyone would be seen. Because if you
it was a spy tower.
It's a spy tower. And this is before George Orwell writes about 1984, and it's before the rise of totalitarian Russia and Germany, whatever. It's an amazingly prescient comment about the future of Europe that the Netziv was on the precipice of. But I think it's also a very deep reading of what might have been the problem with Babel, that there's a type of universalism that requires uniformity, and that's not natural for humanity. The only way to prolong that sort of uniformity is by force, because it won't happen naturally. If you leave a human culture to flourish in natural ways, it will splinter, it will divide, because people have different opinions and different ways of thinking and different ways of being. And if universalism is your primary objective for humanity, the only way to police that is with force.
But if you go back to this point about family, because they are presented as being V'naselenu Shem, it's interesting, it's a very obvious play also on the family of Shem.
Yes.
There's definitely here some sort of relationship between these people and the family that will eventually make a real name for themselves, and not these people. But we also know that a natural impulse in a family unit is also that, we want to be cohesive, we want to be together. And we all know, since we're all part of them, that families are not like that. And even within a small unit of, 5, 6, 7 people, you'll have a diversity of opinion and thought. And so certainly if that can't even be preserved in that kind of way within a small family unit, to think that one could preserve that on a national level, there's something somewhat ridiculous about that.
Exactly. So the last observation I want to make about the story and how and this is I hope what will bring us full square back onto the notion of family and its importance in the kind of biblical imagination, is some comments from Rabbi Sachs in his book The Dignity of Difference, because as I said, he's very interested in this kind of duality between the universal aspects of Judaism and the particular aspects of Judaism. In contemporary philosophy, in the wake of certain arguments put forward by Wittgenstein, there is a broad consensus that language can't develop in isolation. If you lived, like in the Jungle Book, if you were a baby who was just raised in the jungle and you didn't have any human interlocutors, other humans to speak with, Wittgenstein says you'd have no language whatsoever, not even a language of thought. That's a controversial claim, but we can all recognize, I think, immediately that our vocabulary would be impoverished if we had to create all our own words, right? We borrow words from the language we learned, and the language we learned has been spoke by people for generations before us, and we are the heirs, the linguistic heirs of these people, and we make use of their words to give us much more ability to articulate ourselves that we could possibly have if we had to kind of invent a language from scratch.
Just in the past 20 minutes, I'm reminded about the word keen and about the word imagination.
Right.
So I've learned just in the past 20 minutes.
Right. So I think, I think it's, like I said, uncontroversial that a private language that's to say a language invented by a single human being in isolation, would either be impossible, which was Wittgenstein's claim, or at least be impoverished, right?
Yeah.
So a human being needs to be part of a much larger network in order to be expressive. Fabulous. That's part of the universal picture. But we also need much smaller communities. We need families. Why? That's the question I want to ask. We need linguistic communities. We also need smaller communities. Well, Rabbi Sachs thinks that it's only in the family that certain virtues are born. Okay. First of all, he says that biblical morality, he writes, emphasizes the dual nature of our moral situation. On the one hand, we are members of the universal human family, and that much Babel gets right? And that's why we have this Noachite covenant with all of mankind, the Sheva Mitzvot b'nei Noach. It talks about the 3 vignettes of Moshe's life before he becomes leader of the Israelites. It's supposed to illustrate this, because first he intervenes to rescue an Israelite from an Egyptian, then an Israelite from a fellow Israelite, and then he tries to save the non-Israelite daughters of Yitro, of Jethro, from the non-Israelite shepherds who are preventing them from watering their flock. So Moshe clearly recognizes the universal character of injustice and fights against it. But Rabbi Sachs says, on the other hand, we're members of a particular family with its specific history and memory. We are a part of a thick or context-bound morality which confers on us loyalties and obligations to the members of the community that go beyond mere justice. We have duties to our parents and children, friends and neighbors, and the members of society considered as an extended family. I think one way to think of this, Yosefa, is as concentric circles. You start with the individual, and then there's the family, and then there's the community, and then there's the nation, and then there's the brotherhood of humankind as a whole. And it's as if each circle within this kind of set of concentric circles gives meaning to the next one, or even to the one before it, right? To the one before it and the one after it. Who would I be as an individual if I didn't have a family? And what my family be if it wasn't part of the community? What my community be? And so on and so forth. In fact, later on, he says that one of the great intellectual discoveries of the 20th century is that the I, the personal pronoun, the ani, anochi, is actually a fiction, or at the very least an abstraction. Because, and this is where he talks about the private language argument, right? If you were all alone, what would you be, right? He says that Adam is only called Ish, and the word Ish means person. Adam is only called a person when he calls his wife Isha. So it's only in the context of an interpersonal relationship do you become a person. And basically, to cut a very long story short, Rabbi Sachs thinks that if all you have is the individual and very big communities, the only sorts of relationships you'll have are contractual relationships. Those are the sorts of relationships you have with strangers. Mm-hmm. Covenantal relationships, he says, are where we develop the grammar and syntax of reciprocity, where we help others and they help us without calculations of relative advantage. These are the places where trust is born. And without them, there wouldn't be selves. So you wouldn't even have the kind of wherewithal to make it in the big world outside and to form contracts with strangers, right? Contracts, social or economic, he says, mediate relationships between strangers. But if we were always and only strangers to one another, we wouldn't have a reason to trust one another. And that's why they had to build a tower in Babel, I would add, right? To look at what one another's doing, because they mistrust one another, because all they've got is this collective of humanity. The possibility, he says, would always exist and always have to be taken into consideration that the other will defect, says Rabbi Sachs, when it's in his or her interest to do so. A world systematically bereft of fidelity or loyalty would be one in which neither states nor markets would ever get underway. He wants to say, this is a big theme of Rabbi Sachs's writing right throughout his career, he thinks that the market, the economic market, he says, depends on virtues not produced by the market. Mm-hmm. Yeah. He says that the political state in which we live, he says it depends on virtues not created by the state. Where are they created? His answer is in families, in communities, in friendships, in congregations, voluntary associations and fellowships of various kinds. In short, he says, wherever people are brought together not by exchange of wealth or power, but by commitment to one another or to a larger cause they serve in common.
So also to import into a different society, that's one of the many ideas offered about why the founding fathers used the Bible as a basis for the sort of the model of the founding of America, because they were aware of the fact that people needed much more to bind them together than even political commonality, and they needed something that was going to be a moral base.
Yes.
And I think that's a similar idea that he's expressing from a different century, from a different national angle.
And I think the founders of Babel were just unable to recognize that. The brotherhood of man, which is something that is worth striving for, it can't be the foundation. It's an achievement that we arrive at much later on in humanity, in the Jewish vision, at Yemot HaMashiach. Because if it's not built on the foundations of smaller groups, families, friendships, communities, individual nations, it's going to be synthetic rather than organic, and the only way to hold it down will be by force.
I think that brings us really back to that point about why all of the genealogies, which we've sort of glossed over, because, in a podcast of a half hour, we have to choose one moment of the parsha to speak about. But all these genealogies in the first 11 chapters of the book of Bereshit, which we often just gloss over, they seem not so interesting, but they really underscore this point exactly, which is that the basis of the entire world is a family structure. Right. And if we lose focus of that family structure, then we will lose focus of how the world itself really functions.
That's right. You could ask, well, why doesn't it start with the individual rather than the family? And I think Rabbi Sachs's answer is there's a sense in which without being a part of a family, the individual is impoverished. I mean, you can't, that the family is in a sense really the smallest unit. The family is where the siblings learn to negotiate, to forgive, eventually to trust. These are the moral training grounds, and without them, you can't build a community, and without communities, you can't build nations. And I think some people think that nationalism is essentially related to racism, right? And we do see that with a lot of nationalists. But no, on the contrary, I think on Rabbi Sachs's picture, it's by learning to be a member of a family, you learn to be a member of a community. By learning to be a member of a community, you learn to be a member of a nation. And by learning to be a member of a nation, you start to be able to value what it is that other nations value about their identity, so you're able to become part of a brotherhood of man. So that's the basic picture.
I think I'll just sort of end with a comment, which is that I think the complexity really enters into our lives because families communicate in different ways.
Yes.
So the way that, the Lebens family communicates and the way that the fogures/rule family communicates, there are family structures that look the same on the outside, but they're actually very different on the inside. And so I think that that's sort of the birthplace of a lot of the complexity that people have within their families and also with how to be able to sort of imitate those relationships on broader levels, which I'll also just say to our listeners, I opened with a passage just about that from Rabbi Sachs in last week's episode on Bereshit, where he speaks about the family as the blueprint for every other larger web that we can have in our lives. And that's the reason why the Torah begins with family as opposed to beginning with a nation, simply because it would be the wrong place to start how we communicate with the world. But I think that in that same vein, when there is some sort of failure or a short-circuiting that happens within the family structure, there's something about it that is so difficult and stays with us, and we have such a hard time sort of moving past it because it stands so much at the foundation of who we are. If we have a difficulty with a friend, it might also really, really bother us and stay with us in our heart, but it doesn't unwind us necessarily in the same way that family structures, if they don't develop in a way that are peaceful enough, it can be something that really stay with us for such a long time.
Yeah, and I think you're making a fabulous point, because I think also it's actually the seed of linguistic diversity too, is the family, because we all have our own languages in a sense, like you said. There's this amazing, we don't have time to talk about it, there's this amazing Rav Tzadok in the Pri Tzaddik, where he says that the real problem with Babel wasn't that they had one language. The Bible has two words for language, a safa and a lashon. And it's described as having one safa. A safa is the lip, and the lashon is the tongue. He thinks this corresponds to two ways of using language. One way of using language is from the lip and outward, which is like a superficial use of language where you're not really expressing deep down who you really are. And the lashon is where you really have deep interpersonal connections because you express through your language something that's internal to you. And I suppose that it's only in the family that we have that we learn the skills to understand ourselves and to express ourselves in a way that could be called a lashon rather than merely a safa.
Wow. Yeah. That's a beautiful idea. I never heard that before.
It's amazing.
Okay, we're going to have to end this even though we've been going for a very long time.
Yeah. So now you see how it's
so
a family. It's all about families. The Babel. It's all about families.
Yeah, we can keep going forever. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
really was a pleasure and an honor to be able to have this conversation with you.
Absolutely. Lovely to meet you. Thank you.
I hope you've enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I'm Dr. Elisheva Frist, and this is One-on-One Women Talk Torah, a series brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. Please do One-on-One and Women's Torah Learning a small favor by sharing this podcast with family and friends so that we can reach new listeners. You can stream and download these episodes on Spotify, iTunes, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Matan's website. Don't forget to leave us a 5-star review in the comments. Please send us any feedback at podcast@matan.org.il. That's podcast@matan.org.il. Thanks for listening, everyone.